In a world where it's at least theoretically plausible to have three parents through genetic manipulation, this week we have the filmic equivalent of that. The Frame is what I believe you'd get if you managed to cross The Truman Show and The Matrix and then inject a little of the Lake House's DNA into it. It's again from the mind of Mr. Winans, who brought us Inc., and it stars David Carranza, Tiffany Mullen, and of course Christopher Soren Kelly in a wonderful triple role, but we will get to that later. Just a quick aside, I do think Mr. Kelly, as well as Steve Seeley and Shauna Earp, seem to be Mr. Winans' go-to guys. He's been at least in the last two that I've looked at. I haven't looked at 11:59, I think it was, but we'll see. But on to The Frame. So as I say, Mr. Kelly does indeed have three roles, although he's only credited under one, and that is the mechanic. Now, one of the meanings, at least, of mechanic is someone that makes things work, or someone that fixes things. And in two of the three roles in particular, you can see this. Alex sees him as a crime lord, making him do this one last job before the season finale, before the series finale even. And with Sam, he's the therapist. He's making sure that she's not overthinking things, not trying to shake the world up. Again, he's trying to make sure that the plot carries on. And you could argue in these two roles in particular, he's almost like a producer or director himself, or even a writer. He's there to make the story continue, he's there to keep it on track. So probably more of a producer-style role. But this could be an interesting parallel to people like Mr. Winans and, directors, producers, writers, etc. out there. Their job is to make the characters go down certain paths. But sometimes these characters have minds of their own. A lot of people who write say that the characters tell you what they want to do. If you're writing well, the characters are guiding your hand. And I think this is what we're seeing here. Maybe this is a bit of a self-reflective piece for Mr. Winans and, like I say, for directors, producers, writers out there. One of the interesting methods that's used to tell the story, as well as a sort of non-linear storytelling that we've come to know from Inc. at least, is the crossovers, which the first happens within the first sort of 15-16 minutes, which is good. We want to sort of get into the story fairly quickly. And I'm glad that, it doesn't drag on too long, where we sort of see that crossover. We sort of see that perhaps some things are not as they seem. As far as we were aware, we were in one world, it was one life that we were looking at, it wasn't this weird mixing of worlds. This is where it starts to really get interesting, the meat of the story comes out. And it is an interesting idea, if these two people are TV shows to each other, who is the real one? Is there a real one? Are we even real in this? But I think that's the thread to be picked up a little later on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. One of the interesting parts of Alex's story in particular is the fact that his show's coming to a close. He is approaching his series finale. So the world is degrading. It's turning back to Inc. Because, of course, this is written. It's a show. And the Shadowy Man, the third version of the mechanic, is, I think, a sort of agent of this, but also helped by this, because later he mentions the whole thing about the devil, sort of escaping the house by breaking it down, by destroying it. And I think that's what he's trying to do. He's getting out of this quote-unquote house, this show, this world. And the only way he can do that is to help facilitate its destruction, its return to nothingness as the show draws to a natural close. One of the big questions I think I had, and I'm guessing a lot of people probably do as well, is why these two? Why, of all the people that could cross over, of all the people that could share world space for a period, why these two? What makes them special? And I believe it is to do with some commonalities within them. They both have pasts that they are not happy with or wish to escape. Sam's is more, her own mistakes, I guess, to a degree, but also, poor upbringing, I think, was a factor. But with Alex, it's something that was entirely out of his control, and, it's also the reason that he doesn't want the violin, he doesn't want the fiddle, because it's a horrible and painful memory for him. Of course, from a show's perspective, we would lap this up as an audience, some kind of conflict, some issue that the character has, a deep backstory. But it is interesting, I think, that they do have this commonality. But another commonality that I think is overlooked is the fact that they both actually take place in Los Perdidos, which means the lost. But an interesting element to this is, yes, Alex is lost. He doesn't have a home, as it were. That was taken from him way back when he was a child. But Sam's show is called Union Hope, and she, I think, is a lot more hopeful. Alex does play the lost character very well. He's struggling, you know. That's what his life is. But Sam wants to look at the positive. You know, even when we first see her dancing around the apartment, doing what we all knew, I'm sure, talking to ourselves, talking to our dinner, you know, just chilling out. But I think that's an interesting similarity and difference with these characters that I think really helps sell their story together. But of course, one of the really sad elements of that is that these are, even though they're in the same place, like I've mentioned, Los Perditos, it's still a separate world. They are just, if you will, peering through a wormhole as they look through the TV at each other. Although, obviously, the humming and, you know, the tune seems to imply that there is a melody to the universe, or a beat of the world. This is where we're seeing some of the crossover elements with Ink, I think, coming in. You know, the fact that there is a beat of the universe in place. Why not a melody? When she's humming and the world starts shaking later on when they try and meet in public, it's all part of that. You know, there's a melody, there's a reason, there's a rhyme, there is music to the world, and I think that's a very beautiful idea to take away. There is music to the world, there is a beauty that you only have to tune into, and I do think this is something that Mr. Winans perhaps believes himself, which is why, from what I understand, he scores things at the same time as sort of making them. He doesn't wait until it's all done, and I think that really cements this idea of this rhythm, of this music of the world. But on the subject of music, I do find it interesting when he tries to call, you know, gets a phone number and there's a chime on the other side, which is the same as we hear for the shadow mechanic, if you will. Again, these common threads, these musical common threads, it's something that I think Mr. Winans really appreciates. The sonic texture of not only, you know, the created piece that he's made, or the created pieces that he's made, but of the world itself. One of the most influential characters in Alex's life is Noah, and he's just beautifully acted, beautifully written, just a beautiful character, really. And the way he accepts his fate, you know, none of us are going to live forever, but he accepts that he's going to go sooner than most, you know, at this point in the story, as it were. And his line to Alex is just so beautiful.
There's a light shining on you, son. I know you're angry for all that you've been given, for all the things you've had to do. I know you're scared. But we're tested so that we can look through the eyes of God and see in ourselves what He sees.
Even as an agnostic or an atheist, I think it's hard to deny the beauty of what he says there. If you want to perhaps put a secular spin on it, instead of saying, you know, through God's eyes, why not sort of say we see ourselves as the best we can be? We see our potential being realised. You know, I think it's a beautiful way of looking at the world. Adversity happens. It's not sunshine and lollipops and rainbows all the time. And frankly, we appreciate those moments better because of that. If it was all good all the time, we'd be bored, let's be honest. But I could go on about Noah for hours. I think he's a beautiful character. I love him, you know, to pieces. It's a great character. But this isn't a video just about him, so let's move on. So like I mentioned before, you know, they do try and meet. They go to the bridge, and this is where the mechanic comes to both of them individually. You know, we actually see more clearly his face for the first time. We go, oh, Christopher Soren Kelly, I know him. Although I did get it by the voice by then. But, you know, he's clearly trying to prevent them meeting. And he only comes, again, like I said before, when she's humming. When the world is starting to break, the walls are getting weaker. Then he appears and derails. He doesn't want them interfering with each other's world. He doesn't want the narrative to be broken. He doesn't want these shows to be messed up. And that's quite interesting. It really shows us, I think, everything we need to know about the mechanic as a character. He is there to make sure that they carry on the plotline. Nothing more, nothing less. And then in the third sort of shadowy, hat-wearing guy version, he's trying to escape the world himself. So it's a very interesting character, this three facets, and I think he does well. You know, they are individual, I think, in a good way, so props to Mr. Kelly there. And it is interesting that as he's walking away, he mentions his phone before it even rings. This again, I think, cements the fact that he is outside of this. He's kind of linked to the creator's world more than the character's world. Which, of course, you know, he does want to keep them on track so he can escape. It does make sense. But a thought occurred to me about this point in the film, obviously, you know, as he's trying to keep them in this world of suffering, really, and hardship, that when we create, you know, as makers of fiction in any form, if we create this, are we making things suffer? Are we cruel if we write hardships for our characters? I mean, as far as, you know, the characters were aware, you know, Alex thought that Sam was played by Tiffany Moalam on TV. She thought he was played by David Carranza on TV, which I love the fact that they use the actual actor's name. But, you know, we see that they are in fact alive, they are suffering, they are having these experiences, they are having these memories. As far as they're aware, this is their life. They're not fictional. It's not for fun. They're suffering. And is that wrong of us to create these characters? You know, I don't know. If we ever found out that the characters we're writing were actually alive, in a sense, you know, that we could consider them alive and sentient, would it then be cruel? Up till that point, is it not cruel? I think maybe once we saw evidence of sentience, maybe that's when we'd have to admit that it would be cruel. But everything up to that point would still matter. And I think this is something that this film particularly brings into question. The creation of something to suffer, to go through hardships. The title of the film, I've not really mentioned, you know, sort of much, but the title of the film is very interesting in a lot of ways. I mentioned, obviously, it's, you know, sort of like part the Matrix. And a frame and a matrix can also be considered similar words, like a matrix can be a framework. But as we see more later, and I will get sort of into this when it comes up, but a frame is a film term. It's this box right here. This is the frame. It's what you're seeing. And maybe once we can open that frame up, once we can actually go through the frame and see the world beyond the frame, we can understand it and realise what makes it tick. And I think that's what the basic idea of this film is. It's playing with the idea of, you know, these creations, these characters, these fictional worlds are only fictional whilst they're constrained inside this little box. Once that box starts to waver, the world starts to become more real. And that's a problem if we're creating these characters to suffer. And like I've said, there are thematic links throughout from Inc. And I think one of the other big ones, whilst we're talking about the suffering of characters, is their backstories. You know, they are both trying to rise above their pasts. And as I said in that review, which you can see right here, as I said in that, you know, John is escaping from his past, and he doesn't have to be constrained by the things that have happened. This is a thematic link here. They do not have to be constrained. They can go past their past. They can be more than what has come before them. And I do think that is a nice thematic link between the two. I think it's a good worldview to have, that we're not constrained by what's come before, but I did touch on that better, I think, in Inc. Like I said, it's just an interesting carryover. But as we progress through, you know, sort of we start to see how the world is getting more and more broken down. On Sam's part, she's actually able to go to Double Edge Films, which is a nice self-referential moment there, and go and sort of see the writing room. But before she enters, the mechanic, as the psychiatrist, the therapist, is trying to stop her, but he can't get close. There's like an impenetrable barrier. So even though the mechanic is clearly not part of the world in the normal sense, he's not a scripted character, he's still limited. Again, as he says later on, the only way he can escape, the only way the devil escapes the house is to burn it down. And this is evidence of that. His power, even as much as he seems to be in tune with the world, he has some power, but it's not limitless. He is constrained. One interesting parallel that I caught with this was with Donnie Darko. In that, of course, there's the idea of wormholes, and the fact that we all have a path, if you will, that he's able to see. But he does ask the question of, if we could see into God's channel, could we control things? And I think there's an interesting parallel. I mean, we could argue maybe the frame is a similarity here, but I think the script is a lot more, because the script is what's guiding the characters. The script is what's making things happen. So in that kind of parallel, I do think that, sort of when the script is being changed, that is like Donnie being able to see into other people's wormholes, into their channels, into their paths, and change what happens. I think when Sam gets the script and changes it and destroys it and, sort of ends up burning it, that is an interesting parallel that I caught. But as we see, Sam does help short term, but Alex's world is still falling apart. It's not stopped the series from being cancelled. So without any new episodes, there is nothing new to be written. And that's a problem. She, like I say, she's helped short term, but the world is still falling apart. We see the Shadow Mechanic reclaiming things in ink, and obviously ranting at Alex's face. And the question really comes of who controls the narrative. Can a creation take control? Taken more into a real-world perspective, are we instruments of fate or destiny? Or are we in control of our own narratives? Are we just characters in some pre-written play? And only by extreme force of will and effort, and perhaps a little bit of chance and luck, can we rewrite our stories? Well, I think this film is telling us that no, we are in control. Again, like with the thematic link from Ink about not being controlled by your past, you're also not controlled by any sort of sense of destiny or fate. There is no fate but that which we make ourselves, to paraphrase. And even if we are just characters somewhere, I think we can all do a Sam. We can all rewrite the script, even if it's for someone else. Even if we can't necessarily do it for ourselves. As we see when Alex tries to do it, the frame pushes him out the way. This is where that wonderful idea of the visual frame of the film is done to great effect. I think this was an amazingly done scene, or a few times that it happened. It's well done to try and basically force him into where it wants him. It's saying, I want you to do this, and he's fighting. He makes an interesting realisation, even though he couldn't do the same thing as like Sam did, sort of take the script and rewrite it for himself, etc. He could still figure out a new way. He manages to punch through. And, we see this force of effort, this force of will. And we then see why we kept hearing Ayudame, why the whole history with the violin, we see that, we see his life as it was before, the past that he's escaping, and this is where he comes through into Sam's world. He pops into existence there. The car flips out of the way. She's no longer in danger. They can be together. Now, this is very much open to interpretation, as an ending goes. Did he die? Was this just a fanciful vision in his dying mind? Or did he really circumvent the constraints of his life? And is he now a character in Sam's tale? Or are they both free? There's a lot of open-ended questions. I like to believe that he made it through. I like to take it as an actual science fiction / fantasy story. More fantasy than science fiction, really. I like to see it as an actual fantasy story, and that it is possible for him to punch through and traverse worlds. If you want to take it from a religious perspective and say that this is some kind of heaven, that's your interpretation. I think with this and Ink, the key is really, it's all up to you. I've enjoyed watching Ink, I enjoyed watching this. This was a lot more, I think, tough going, because I think there's a lot more layers to it. There's a lot more that you can sort of pick apart. but I enjoyed the ideas of it, and like I say, thematically they are such good companion pieces because they both have that core message. You don't have to be constrained by your past, and you can control your own destiny. Just do it. You know, as Mr. Winans and those around him have done. He wanted to make films, he made a production company. He wanted music that really suited the film. He scored it as he was making it. He wanted to make sure it was a consistent vision. He wrote it and directed it. He wanted to make sure people he trusted were in the roles, so he did. He got the people in there. And that's respect. You know, that is a respectable thing to do. He took risks. And I think more people need to do that. You know, take control of their own lives and just go, I want it this way, and I'll do what I can. So until next time, as always, take care.